Hi, this is Dennis from MediaMacro.tips, and today I wanted to share somewhat personal experience with the Sony A7 camera. I've been using it for about 2 years, and even though I wasn't the first one to get a full-frame mirrorless camera, I was still pretty excited when I finally bought it for myself in the end of 2015. Before that, I've been using mirrorless APS-C sized Sony NEX5R, and I like that camera, but I was very excited about the possibility the full-frame professional camera would bring to the table. So in this video I want to share my experience over the course of 2 years with this camera, and I think it will be useful not only for people who want to buy used A7, but also for people who are looking closely to Sony A7 II or A7R II, or maybe even Fuji cameras. So let's begin. And let's start with the good, shall we? And probably the good and even the best part of this camera is its sensor, because it's downright amazing. It's not a crazy high resolution as in some more modern cameras or its sibling A7R, but 24 megapixels is more than enough for general use. But where this sensor does excel is in dynamic range, accuracy of colors, and even ISO. When I bought this camera, the sensor was 9th highest ranking sensor on DxOMark, and now 2 years later it's still on 15th place, and only some legendary cameras such as Nikon D800 or Sony A7R or some medium format cameras top it. As for my personal experience, I was blown away after APS-C camera what amount of dynamic range it could capture and what ISOs it could keep up with. So let's take a look at this image, for instance. Can you guess what ISO it was taken at? Let's maybe scale it to 100%, or perhaps even to 200. Can you see the amount of noise? This was taken at ISO 1200. On my APS-C camera at ISO 1200 you could see very little but noise, and on A7 this image is completely useful. The same is true for dynamic range. When you are shooting against the sky, you don't need to take many exposures that often. You can pull out staggering amount of details from shadows and highlight in a single exposure. But you might say that Sony A7R has even better sensor, so why didn't I pick up it? Well, the reason that Sony A7R, even though has twice higher resolution sensor, it also doesn't have electronic shutter. This means that unlike most modern cameras, it needs to move shutter 2 times per shot, once to start exposure and once to finish. Other modern cameras do it only once at the end of exposure, because first shutter is electronic. And on A7R the shutter is so powerful and so disturbing that I read many reviews that it caused blurred images, because when shutter moves the first time there is some vibration on the body of the camera, and so you end up with unsharp pictures. Of course, it happened only on certain shutter speeds, but when you pay over $1,000 for a camera, I think it's fair to expect no compromises, and Sony A7 offered exactly that. Maybe a little less of image quality, but more versatility. Another thing I love about A7 is its body. Now, I know there are some mixed reviews on the internet about how well it handles, but I love the body construction and that it's weatherproof. I shot with it next to the most powerful waterfall in Europe, and it handled it pretty well. It kept on shooting as long as I needed to. So here's the picture just to give you a sense of scale. And I find the controls on camera are also excellent. Now I wish there were some more of them, but those that are present, they are exactly right to my taste. The next huge advantage and the thing I love about A7 is its size. I mean, it's probably the smallest full-frame camera on the market still, and it gives you unique opportunities to take advantage of a full-frame sensor in situations where you wouldn't be able with other cameras such as Nikon D810 or maybe Canon 5D Mark IV. Let alone the fact that now when you take a camera with you to a vacation, it doesn't feel like work anymore, because the lenses are light, the camera is light, everything is light and very compact. Another great thing about this camera is the value you get. Now I spent on it about $1,000, and now for this kind of money you can get A7 II with image stabilization, but that's not the point. What I wanted to bring your attention to is that it's much cheaper than comparable DSLR cameras. I mean, new bodies, of course. When you at used cameras, the situation may differ a little bit, but talking about new full-frame body, I think Sony A7 or A7 II now is as cheap as you can get a full-frame sensor. So, and when you combine this with best in class or almost best in class image sensor and this unique compactness, I think it makes for pretty darn good, or maybe even the best value. But of course nothing is cheap without a reason, and that's the point where I want to switch to bad sides of this camera. And one of the biggest limiting factor of Sony mirrorless system is lens selection. Now when I bought this camera, it was really scarce. There were no good lenses whatsoever, except for 28mm f2.0 lens that I picked up immediately because it's great value. For $400 you get top performance glass, but other than that there are really few good lenses that support autofocus. Now the solution to this is use lenses from third-party manufacturers via adapters, or if you're lucky enough and your manufacturer makes native lens, then use it, but then you lose the ability to autofocus, and that might be a pretty big deal for some people. But little by little situation is improving now, but still now you have like top notch performing glass, but it costs a lot of money, like over $1,500 for instance, yes, and you can get very cheap glass like for maybe $150, like Sony 55mm full frame lens, but that lens doesn't perform very well. What I wish for is more of enthusiast class glass for about $500 a piece, which would perform great. So I think Sony should take their experience with a 28mm lens that is so excellent and just build it for different focal length. Until that, I'll stick to my Samyang 14mm for landscape shots and some old Soviet camera lens for portrait shots. Another thing that I'm not a fan of is a viewfinder. Now, I have nothing against the viewfinder itself, although I wish it was just a little bit bigger, but what I don't like is the location of it. You see, it's situated in the middle of the camera, just where the lens is. Now, I understand why DSLRs have it like this. This is because there is physical mirror that needs to direct light to the viewfinder, right? but on mirrorless cameras the viewfinder is digital, so you can place it wherever you want. And I think it's much more usable and better when viewfinder is situated to the left of the camera, so that you can put the camera to your face without hitting the body with your nose all the time. Like for instance, it's done on Leica cameras or even Sony's APS-C series such as A6500. Why they don't do this on their professional cameras, I don't understand really. I guess it's for the looks, but I always think usability is more important than how the camera looks. Another thing that disappointed me was the quality of JPEGs. Now, I don't shoot JPEGs, so that's not a huge deal breaker for me, because I always post-process from RAW. But sometimes, you know, when I give a camera to my friend or to my wife, they just want to take pictures without the need for post-processing, and sadly, Sony A7 is not very good at taking JPEGs. For instance, take a look here. This is a straight out of camera JPEG, and yeah, just take a second and look at it. And this is post-processed RAW file. And as you can see, the colors are much more true to life, and the harmony is better. Now, of course, I understand that RAW is always going to be better than straight out of camera JPEG, but I was hoping at least for somewhat decent JPEGs, but Sony really struggles with them. But bad JPEGs, poor lens selection, and weird viewfinder is not as bad as the updates. The updates for Sony never happened. Since I bought this camera 2 years ago, Sony published only one software update, and that's it. And it's not like the camera is perfect in software sense of view. In fact, the software is where this camera struggles the most. Yet, after Sony released A7 II cameras, they completely ditched the support for A7, and this makes me question commitment to a manufacturer who doesn't commit back with the updates and bringing new features to the camera. And the biggest blow of all with Sony is its terrible user interface. It's hardly usable. I mean, have you ever taken a look at Sony's menu system? You will get confused, and anytime you need to change anything, it's just so unpleasant. And I wish manufacturers would look to Hasselblad X1D, the new camera, and how the user interface should be done on modern cameras, because now it feels like they come from 1990s. And now we live in the age of smartphones, so I really don't understand why they won't make menu better and put touch screen on their cameras so you can easily manipulate the settings you need. Speaking of the settings, another super upsetting thing for me is the functionality of this camera. I mean, professional features are very much lacking from it. Like, for instance, I cannot do 5 shots bracketing with one-stop exposure. I don't know why that is. Also, I cannot bracket focal length without downloaded special apps, but apps are impossible to use on this camera, so virtually I don't have this feature at all. And Sony do not allow third-party software makers to control their cameras, so the tethering is very limited, and for example, software such as Autofocus, where you can connect camera to a computer and then take several shots with slightly different focal point, so that you can stitch them together in post-processing, would not work, because Sony do not allow the control of the camera through as third-party software. I really wish they would reconsider and change that. And the last thing that I really don't like is the video quality on this camera. because arguably my iPhone 6 takes better video than Sony A7. Now I understand that it's a camera that almost 3 years old, and I'm not asking for a 4K video or anything, but at least decent quality 1080p would be fair to expect. But due to line beaming, it's not so. I mean, the video quality is just awful, and I never use this camera for taking any videos because my iPhone gets that job done better in almost any case except for low light situations, of course, because then the bigger sensor gets its advantage, but anything lower than ISO 1000 will be better looking on your iPhone, I'm serious. So just to sum up, in general I like this camera. I think for the time it was a very good purchase, especially considering the price and value it brings. It's also a pleasure to take it with you wherever you go due to its low weight and compactness, and the sensor is amazing. But you know, I wish that Sony would work a little bit more on the concept and ecosystem, especially of lenses and third-party software, and that user interface they have, they just need to throw it away and build a completely new one, touch-oriented operating system from scratch. So, but what about today? If I was getting a camera today, would I do the same and pick up Sony A7 II? Well, that's a tricky question and the subject for the whole nother video, but generally speaking, I guess no. I would prefer another camera, but let's talk about it next time.